$100 million. 3 years of planning, 47 engineers, and one maintenance worker who saw what none of them did. When Ethan Cole quietly corrected a single line in a structural file at 11:43 on a Tuesday night, he wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to stop a bridge from killing people. But the CEO who runs this company doesn't see a quiet act of conscience. She sees unauthorized access, sabotage, and a maintenance worker who thought he knew better than her entire engineering division. She's about to make the biggest mistake of her career, and so is everyone in that boardroom. Drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The elevator in the Harmon Tower lobby opened every morning at precisely 7:51. And every morning for the past 3 years, Ethan Cole stepped out of it carrying a gray thermos, a canvas work bag, and the particular silence of a man who had long ago made peace with being invisible. He was 32 years old. He stood at 6 feet, had the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than a gym membership, shoulders that filled out a shirt without trying, hands that were permanently calloused at the base of each finger. His face was the kind people forgot in crowds. Not unpleasant, not remarkable, just honest. A jaw that needed a shave. Eyes that were a shade of brown that shifted toward green in certain light. He wore the same thing every day. Dark work pants, a gray Henley, steel-toed boots that had been resoled twice. No one held the elevator for him. The executive assistants on the 3rd floor, the ones who always seemed to be carrying matching tumblers and walking in clusters, had never once asked him his name. The senior engineers on the 7th floor, the ones who wore lanyards with security clearance badges and spoke loudly about load tolerances and thermal coefficients at the coffee machine, stepped aside when he came through with his toolkit and then closed back around their conversations as if he had never passed through. This did not particularly bother Ethan. He had stopped expecting otherwise a long time ago. The company was Meridian Structural Group, a global engineering firm headquartered in a glass and steel tower in Midtown Manhattan, with satellite offices in London, Singapore, and Dubai. Meridian's specialty was infrastructure at scale: bridges, tunnels, elevated transit systems, coastal barriers. They had worked on projects across 40 countries. Their website had a rotating banner of photographs, all of them showing their completed structures from sweeping aerial angles at golden hour, looking immortal and inevitable against the skyline. The tagline read, "Built to last." Ethan worked maintenance. Specifically, he worked on the building's integrated systems, the HVAC routing, the fire suppression grid, the server cooling infrastructure in the basement, and the proprietary engineering software network that ran across all 14 floors. His official title was Facilities Systems Technician, Level 2. His pay grade put him firmly in a salary band that the partners at Meridian wouldn't have recognized as real money. He reported to a man named Gerald Hopper, who was 61, had a bad knee, kept a photograph of a golden retriever on his desk, and was one of the few people in the building who actually said good morning to Ethan and meant it. Most days, Ethan's work was invisible in the way that all maintenance work is invisible. You only notice it when it stops. He fixed what broke. He monitored what hummed. He updated firmware on systems that no one else in the building fully understood anymore because the original installation team had turned over twice since the infrastructure was put in. He was good at it. More than good, actually, though no one had occasion to know that. He understood systems the way some people understand music, not just the rules of it, but the way the parts breathed together, the way a problem in one section sent tremors through the whole. He could look at a network diagram and find the vulnerability the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Fast, quiet, no drama. He did this alone largely because the work was done largely alone. His daughter's name was Maya. She was 7 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a gap between her front teeth that she was immensely proud of. She liked drawing horses even though she had never been near one, had recently become obsessed with the science of weather, and fell asleep every night listening to audiobooks that Ethan set on a 30-minute timer on the small speaker beside her bed. Maya's mother, Renata, had left when Maya was 11 months old. Not dramatically. No screaming, no thrown dishes. She had simply come to Ethan one evening while Maya was sleeping and told him with the careful voice of someone who had been rehearsing for weeks that she wasn't built for this, that she was sorry, that she loved Maya but didn't know how to be what Maya needed. that she thought he would be better at it than she would. Ethan had not argued with her. He had stood in the kitchen of their apartment on 134th Street and listened, and when she finished, he had said very quietly, "Okay." She left 2 days later. She called on birthdays for the first 3 years, and then the calls stopped. He did not spend a lot of time being angry about this because anger required energy that he needed for other things. He had moved them to a smaller apartment in Washington Heights, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen where the counter was just big enough to do homework on, a window that faced east and got the morning light. He enrolled Maya in the elementary school 6 blocks away. He arranged his shift at Meridian to start at 7 and end at 4, which let him pick her up at 3:30 if he moved quickly. He paid a neighbor, Mrs. Osei, $40 a week to be available as backup on the days things ran late. This was his life. He didn't frame it as sacrifice or tragedy. It was just what it was. A man, a kid, a city, a set of responsibilities he took seriously. He didn't talk about it at work because there was no one at work to tell. The Crestline Bridge project had been active for 3 years. Ethan knew about it the way maintenance staff know about everything, not from being briefed or invited to meetings, but from proximity. From the rolled-out blueprints he passed in the hallway, from the arguments he overheard through closed conference room doors, from the names that appeared on the project directory in the server room he accessed weekly. Crestline was a suspension bridge proposal for a crossing over the Hudson River, north of the existing GWB, connecting 2 suburban counties that had been fighting over infrastructure funding for 2 decades. The estimated construction cost was $100 million. Meridian had spent 3 years and approximately $9 million in internal resources developing the structural design proposal. The final review meeting, the one where the client consortium would approve the design and trigger the construction contract, was scheduled for Friday. It was Tuesday night when Ethan found the error. He had been in the server room on the 11th floor doing a scheduled firmware update on the cold storage array that housed Meridian's active project files. The update was routine. It had taken him 40 minutes so far, and the job was almost done. He was running the post-update verification check, something he did automatically, not because anyone had ever asked him to, but because he was the kind of person who checked his work when a file flagged a read inconsistency. It was in a folder labeled crestline_final_struct_v.14. He wouldn't have opened it. It wasn't his business to open it. The flag was likely just a metadata corruption from the update, something common in large KD-adjacent file packages. He would normally have logged it and sent a ticket to the engineering software team to verify, except the file was already partially open in the background. The update process had briefly unlocked it for the integrity check, and the page that was displayed wasn't just a schematic. It was a thermal stress analysis table. Ethan looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down on the rolling stool he kept in the server room, set his thermos on the floor beside him, and looked at it more carefully. The thermal stress variation table was the section of a structural analysis that accounts for how a material, in this case, high-tensile steel cable and reinforced concrete, expands and contracts across seasonal temperature extremes. In New York, that range is brutal. Summer peak temperatures push into the 90s, and winter lows can drop to single digits. The difference between those extremes creates measurable, cumulative mechanical stress in large structures over time. If the tolerances are not properly calculated, the stress doesn't show up as a sudden catastrophic failure. It shows up as a slow, progressive one. A bridge doesn't fall on the day it's built wrong. It falls 5 years later, or 10, or 15. On a Tuesday morning in February when the temperature has been below freezing for 3 weeks. The figure in the thermal expansion coefficient column was wrong. Not wildly wrong, not obviously wrong to someone running a fast check. The number was close enough that anyone reviewing it without deep familiarity with the specific alloy specification and the Hudson Valley microclimate data would have passed right over it. The error was 0.00000043 in a coefficient that should have read 0.00000086, half the correct value. Ethan knew this because he had run this exact calculation before. Not for this project. For his graduate thesis 9 years ago, when he was completing his master's degree in structural engineering at Columbia University. He sat with that for a minute. Then he pulled up the full document. He spent the next 40 minutes going through it. Not all of it. The file was enormous. But the structural load sections, the cable tension specifications, the foundation anchor calculations. He did math in his head that most engineers would have reached for a calculator to do. He had always been fast with numbers, freakishly fast, in the way that some people can sight-read music. The patterns just resolved for him. The error was consistent across 4 related calculations. Someone had pulled the thermal coefficient from a standard reference table for generic structural steel rather than using the project-specific alloy data from the materials specification. It was the kind of mistake that happened when sections of a large project were worked on by different teams in parallel without adequate cross-referencing. No one person had made a catastrophic error. 4 people had each made a small one that added up to something that would, over time, cause the bridge's northern cable anchor system to progressively lose integrity. Under normal load conditions, the bridge would perform correctly for years, possibly decades. But under sustained cold weather loading, the kind of loading you got during a January cold snap when hundreds of vehicles were on the bridge in sub-zero temperatures, the anchor stress would exceed design limits. The first sign would be minor cracking in the anchor housing. The second sign would be more cracking. The third sign would be a news broadcast. Ethan sat in the quiet server room for a long moment. He thought about Friday, about the client meeting, about what happened if this went through without correction. Then he thought about the chain of people he would have to go through to report this. Gerald, who would have to escalate to the building services director, who would have to decide whether to interrupt the engineering division head, who would have to decide whether this was worth bringing to the lead project engineer 2 days before the biggest client meeting of the year. He thought about what it would look like. A maintenance tech flagging a calculation error in a project he had no business being inside. He thought about it carefully. Then he accessed the file. He corrected the thermal expansion coefficient in the 4 affected calculations, cross-referenced each change against the material spec to confirm the values, and documented the changes in the file's internal comment log with a precise description of what had been altered and why. He didn't hide it. He wrote exactly what he had done. He just did it in the log that only someone actively auditing the file would check, rather than sending an email that would require a chain of explanations he wasn't sure he had the standing to make. He finished at 11:43 p.m. He closed the file. He completed the firmware update verification. He packed his tools, picked up his thermos, and took the elevator down to the lobby. He walked to the 168th Street subway station, took the A train home, and checked on Maya, who was asleep with her arm thrown over her weather science book, before he brushed his teeth and went to bed. He didn't tell anyone. What? The next 36 hours were ordinary. Wednesday passed without incident. Ethan replaced a faulty pressure valve in the 14th floor HVAC junction, ran a diagnostic on the security system's battery backup, and ate his lunch, a turkey sandwich he'd made that morning, on the loading dock with Gerald, who talked for 20 minutes about whether the golden retriever in the photograph, who was named Biscuit, would like the new apartment Gerald and his wife were considering in Yonkers. He picked up Maya at 3:30. She had drawn a diagram of a cumulus cloud formation for her science class and wanted to show him. He looked at it carefully at the kitchen table while she explained the difference between cumulonimbus and altostratus, which she had memorized from her book. He told her it was excellent. She asked if they could have noodles for dinner. They had noodles. Thursday morning, he dropped her at school, stopped at the bodega on 181st for a coffee because the thermos had a hairline crack he'd noticed the night before, and arrived at Meridian at 7:51. He stepped out of the elevator into the lobby and immediately understood that something had changed. The feeling was specific. The building had a different quality to its noise, something tighter, something off. The way a room full of people gets quiet in a particular way when the conversation that was happening before you walked in was about you. 2 executive assistants near the reception desk went quiet as he passed through. One of them looked at her phone. The other looked at him and then quickly away. He kept walking. Gerald was waiting for him at the door to the maintenance office on the 2nd floor. The expression on Gerald's face, tight around the eyes, something uncomfortable sitting behind it, told Ethan everything he needed to know before Gerald said a word. "There's been a situation," Gerald said. I don't have all the details, But I was asked to tell you when you came in that you're expected in the executive boardroom on the 12th floor at 9 o'clock. Ethan looked at him. The executive boardroom. That's what I was told. By who? Gerald hesitated. Ms. Grant's office. Ethan didn't move for a moment. He set his canvas bag down on the chair by his locker. Okay, he said. Ethan? Gerald's voice had dropped. He was looking at Ethan with something that wasn't quite apology, but was adjacent to it. I don't know what this is about. I want you to know that whatever's happening, I want you to know I vouched for you, to whoever asked me. What did they ask you? Whether you'd had access to the 11th floor server room on Tuesday night. Ethan held Gerald's gaze. I did have access to it. I was running the scheduled firmware update. I told them that. Okay. Ethan. Gerald hesitated again. Then, do you want me to call someone? HR, or I'm not sure exactly what kind of... I'm fine, Ethan said. Thank you, Gerald. He hung up his bag. He changed out of his jacket into the slightly less worn version of his gray Henley that he kept in his locker for building inspections. He drank half of the bodega coffee standing at the window that looked out over the building's rear service alley, watching a pigeon negotiate its way across a wet ledge. At 8:58, he took the elevator to the 12th floor. He had never been to the 12th floor. The executive level at Meridian Structural Group existed in a different atmosphere than the rest of the building. The floors below it were ordinary corporate space, open plan, glass partition offices, the particular off-white of carpet chosen to survive heavy traffic. The 12th floor was quiet and warm and precisely lit, with dark wood paneling along the corridor walls and the muted kind of decor that communicated money without having to announce it. There were framed photographs of completed Meridian projects on the walls, the same bridge photos from the website, but printed large, in matte black frames. A woman at the reception desk near the elevator, mid-40s, precise haircut, the professional coolness of someone who managed access to powerful people for a living, looked up as Ethan stepped off. Mr. Cole? Yes. I'll let them know you're here. She picked up her phone, said 3 quiet words into it, and then stood. Follow me, please. The boardroom was at the end of the corridor. The door was closed. Through the glass partition beside it, Ethan could see people seated around a long table, 8 or 9 of them, maybe, and could see at the far end of the table a woman standing. She had her back to the glass. Even from here, with her back turned, there was something about the way she stood that made the room arrange itself around her. The assistant opened the door. Isabella Grant turned around. Ethan had seen her before. She was the CEO of Meridian Structural Group. 32 years old, which was an age that still made certain people in the industry do a double-take when they learned it. She had taken over as CEO 3 years ago after her predecessor retired unexpectedly, having come up through the company's project finance division and then its international operations arm. Her name appeared in architectural and engineering trade publications often enough that her face was familiar to anyone who spent time in those circles. In person, she was different from the photographs. Taller than he expected. She wore a charcoal suit that was tailored close and a white shirt with no jewelry except small gold studs. Her hair was dark, pulled back with the kind of precision that suggested she did it the same way every morning. She was striking in a way that wasn't comfortable, not warm, not inviting, just sharply, unambiguously present, like a structural load that demanded to be accounted for. Her eyes found him the moment the door opened, and they stayed on him. The room was already wrong. Ethan could read rooms. It was a skill he'd developed from years of walking into spaces where he didn't belong and learning to assess them fast. The 8 people at the table were a mix of faces he didn't know well and faces he recognized from passing them in corridors. 2 of them were senior engineers from the Crestline project. He'd seen their names on the server directory. One was a man he knew slightly, Marcus Hale, Meridian's head of project operations, who was 51 and had the practiced stillness of a man who had sat through a lot of difficult meetings. The others were executive level, judging by the suits and the laptops open in front of them. None of them were looking at him with warmth. "Close the door," Isabella Grant said. It was not directed at Ethan. It was directed at the room in general, and the assistant who had walked him in closed it and retreated without a word. Isabella Grant did not invite Ethan to sit. She stood at the end of the table with her hands resting on the back of her chair and looked at him across the length of the room. "Your name is Ethan Cole," she said. "You're a level 2 facilities technician. You've been employed at Meridian for 3 years." "Yes," he said. "On Tuesday night, between approximately 10:30 and midnight, you accessed a restricted engineering file on the 11th floor server, a file belonging to the Crestline Bridge project, a project with a contractual value of $100 million. She paused. "The access was unauthorized. Your clearance level covers building systems maintenance. It does not cover project engineering files." "I know," he said. "You opened the file, and you made modifications to it." "Yes." The room reacted to that. Not loudly. There was no gasping or exclamation, but something tightened. Marcus Hale shifted slightly in his chair. Someone near the far end of the table put down their pen. Isabella Grant's expression didn't change. "You don't deny it." "I'm not going to deny something I did," he said. "Then explain it." Her voice was flat and precise, like a blade that had been sharpened to a very specific purpose. "Explain why a maintenance worker broke into a restricted project file 48 hours before a major client review and made unauthorized changes to a structural analysis." And there it was, the word she'd chosen. Broke into. The framing was already set. He could see it in the faces around the table. The premise had been established before he walked through the door. He was a maintenance worker who had accessed something he shouldn't have and altered it. Everything after that was just the nature of the verdict. Ethan stood in the center of the room and felt the familiar weight of it. The particular heaviness of standing in a place where people have already decided what you are. He had been here before. Not in this room, but in this feeling. He didn't let it rattle him. "There was a calculation error in the thermal stress analysis," he said. "In the expansion coefficient table for the Northern Cable anchor system. The value being used was sourced from a generic reference standard. It should have been drawn from the project-specific alloy specification. The discrepancy is small enough that a routine review would miss it. Over time, under cold weather load conditions, it would result in progressive anchor failure." Silence. Then, from the left side of the table, one of the Crestline engineers, a man in his mid-50s named, according to the server directory, Dennis Waite, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That's a remarkable diagnosis from someone who came in to update firmware." "I wasn't trying to make a diagnosis," Ethan said, looking at Waite steadily. "I was trying to correct a mistake." "You altered a restricted engineering document without authorization. The file was opened during the update integrity check. The page that was displayed was the thermal analysis table. I looked at it. I saw the error. I corrected it." "You corrected it." Waite's voice had picked up an edge. "Do you have any idea what that document represents? The hours that went into it? The review cycles it's been through? The number of qualified engineers who have signed off on—" "I understand what it represents," Ethan said. "And I understand that none of that changes the fact that the coefficient is wrong." Waite started to say something else, and Isabella Grant said, "Dennis," and he stopped. She was still looking at Ethan. Something in her expression had shifted. Not softened, not warmed, but recalibrated, like a sensor adjusting to new input. "You're saying there's a structural error," she said, "in the Crestline final design." "Yes." "And you found this error while doing a routine firmware update?" "Yes." "And rather than reporting it through the appropriate channel, I documented the change in the file's internal comment log. Precisely. Everything I changed and why. I didn't hide it." "Rather than reporting it through the appropriate channel," she repeated, as if he hadn't spoken, "you altered the file yourself." The room had a particular texture now. Tight, coiled, waiting. Ethan looked at Isabella Grant across the length of that conference table, and he thought about the bridge, about the anchor housing cracking in February, about a traffic report on the radio at 7 a.m. He thought about Maya at home right now, getting out her weather science book. "Yes," he said. "I did." The silence in the room was the kind that had an opinion. Isabella Grant straightened. She picked up a slim folder from the table in front of her and opened it. I have authorization to place you on administrative leave pending a full review of the unauthorized file access. That review will include an IT forensics assessment of what was changed and, before you do that, Ethan said, I'd like to ask for 5 minutes. She looked at him. Let me show you the error, he said. Not describe it, show it to you. Run the calculation live with the project materials spec pulled up beside it. He looked around the table. Any of the engineers in this room can check my work in real time. If I'm wrong, the leave is appropriate. If I'm right, he paused. I think the conversation changes. Another silence. Dennis Waite looked like he wanted to object. The man beside him, younger, early 40s, whose lanyard identified him as the project's lead calculations engineer, was looking at Ethan with an expression that was harder to read, something in it that wasn't contempt. More like the careful look of someone who had just heard a note played slightly off-key and wasn't yet sure if it was the instrument or their own ear. Isabella Grant closed the folder. 5 minutes, she said. Someone pull up the Crestline file. Down. The projector screen at the far end of the room came to life. The calculations engineer, his name, Ethan had now read off his lanyard, was Paul Okafor, pulled up the Crestline structural file on his laptop and mirrored it to the screen. He opened the thermal stress analysis section without being asked, which told Ethan something about Okafor. Ethan walked to the front of the room. He was aware of how he looked standing there. Gray Henley, work boots. Standing at a boardroom projector screen in front of 9 people who held advanced degrees in fields adjacent to what he was about to do. He felt the awareness of it, the absurdity of it, almost. And then he set it down and focused. The thermal expansion coefficient for the northern cable anchor assembly, he said, pointing at the table on screen. Column F, row 14. The value entered is 0.000043. He looked at Okafor. Can you open the materials specification? The alloy data sheet for the cable anchor housing. Okafor hesitated for a fraction of a second, then navigated to the spec file. He opened it. Page 7 of the alloy data sheet, Ethan said. Table 2B. Okafor found it. He mirrored it beside the analysis table. The room looked at both numbers. The spec showed 0.000086. The silence had a different quality now. The analysis is using half the correct value, Ethan said. The source was almost certainly a standard generic table for grade A 36 structural steel, which is what a lot of reference materials default to. The anchor housing in this design uses a modified high-tensile alloy with a significantly higher thermal expansion rate. He pulled his gaze away from the screen and looked around the table. Over a 12 degrees Celsius seasonal range, which is conservative for this region, the cumulative differential expansion in the anchor system would be approximately twice what the design accounts for. The anchor housing is rated to handle the calculated stress. It is not rated to handle the actual stress. Waite had gone quiet. His arms were crossed, but the aggressive certainty that had been in his posture a few minutes ago had folded slightly inward. Okafor was running something on his laptop. His expression had gone carefully neutral, in the way that engineers go neutral when they are doing math they're not sure they want to arrive at. No one spoke for almost 2 minutes. Then Okafor said quietly, "He's right." The words went through the room like a door slamming in a quiet house. "The recalculation confirms the differential," Okafor said, not looking up from his laptop. His voice was precise and flat. At the corrected coefficient, the anchor housing stress under sustained winter load conditions exceeds design tolerance by... He paused, checked the number again. Approximately 18%. Waite's arms uncrossed. Marcus Hale leaned forward and put his elbows on the table. Someone at the far end of the room made a sound. Not words, just a short, compressed sound, and went quiet. Isabella Grant stood perfectly still at the end of the table, and for the first time since Ethan had walked into the room, she was not looking at him the way she'd been looking at him. The precision in her face was still there. She was not a woman whose composure broke easily or quickly, but something behind it had shifted. Something was recalculating. "The change I made to the file," Ethan said, because he felt the need to be complete, restored the correct coefficient across the 4 calculations where the incorrect value had propagated. I documented each change with the source reference in the internal comment log. He looked at her directly. I didn't change anything else. The original design intent is intact. The anchor system geometry, the cable configuration, the foundation specifications, all unchanged, only the thermal value. The room was quiet. Isabella Grant held his gaze. Then Marcus Hale said, almost to himself, "Who are you?" It wasn't a rhetorical question. He was genuinely asking. Ethan looked at him, then back at the screen, then at his hands briefly, the way a person does when they're deciding how much of themselves to lay out in a room that hasn't earned it yet. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said. "I work maintenance." Hale shook his head slowly. "Nobody in maintenance runs a live structural recalculation in their head." Ethan said nothing. "Where did you—" Hale stopped. Started again. "What's your background?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have a master's degree in structural engineering from Columbia. I graduated 9 years ago. My thesis was on thermal stress modeling in hybrid alloy suspension structures." He paused. "I left engineering before I started working here." The room absorbed that. It did so imperfectly, the way rooms absorb unexpected information, with visible seams. Okafor had looked up from his laptop. He was looking at Ethan with an expression that was complex, something in it that might have been respect, and something in it that looked like professional discomfort, and something underneath both of those things that looked like the beginning of genuine shame. Waite was looking at the table. Isabella Grant was looking at Ethan. The silence stretched out, and in it, the shape of what had happened in this room in the last hour began to clarify. Not just the error, not just the correction, the full architecture of it. A man who knew exactly what he was looking at, who had fixed a problem at his own risk, who had walked into a room where he'd already been convicted, and who had just demonstrated, quietly, without theatrics, without a single raised voice, that the people who were supposed to catch this hadn't. The Friday client meeting was in 36 hours. The bridge hadn't been built yet. Not a single cable, not a single anchor housing, not a single poured foundation. The error was in a file on a server. Ethan looked at Isabella Grant, and he waited. She didn't speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was measured in a way that told him she was managing something, not lying, but controlling the pace of what she let show. "This meeting is on hold," she said to the room. "Paul, I want a full independent review of the thermal analysis before end of day. Marcus, hold all client communications on Crestline until further notice." She looked at Ethan. "Mr. Cole," she said, "you are not to leave the building." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't friendly either. It was the voice of someone who has just had the ground shift under her and is in the process of deciding how to redistribute her weight. He nodded once. "Understood." He walked to the door. He felt the eyes of the room on his back as he reached for the handle. Behind him, he heard Marcus Hale say, very quietly, to no one in particular, 3 years. He's been here 3 years. Ethan opened the door and walked out. He took the elevator back down to the second floor. He sat in the maintenance office in his rolling chair and finished the bodega coffee, which had gone cold. Through the small window, he could see the service alley and the pigeon, who had moved to a different ledge. At 3:30, if nothing had changed, he needed to pick up Maya. He sat with that. The simple fact of it. The way it grounded everything else. The bridge, the boardroom, the way Okafor's voice had gone flat when the number came up wrong, the way Isabella Grant had looked at him. All of it existed out there, in the large and complicated world of Meridian Structural Group and its $100 million project. But at 3:30, Maya was going to come out of the school on 181st Street, and she was going to look down the sidewalk for him. And when she found him, she was going to start talking before she reached him, probably about weather systems or horse anatomy, and he was going to listen. He had things to do first. He set down the coffee cup. He opened his laptop and started writing the formal incident report. He wrote it carefully, completely, and with the same precision he'd used in the file's comment log. Not protecting himself, not exaggerating, just documenting exactly what had happened and exactly why he had done what he did, in the clear and technical language of a man who understood what mattered and what didn't. He finished it in 40 minutes. He sent it to Gerald. He sent it to HR. He sent a copy to Marcus Hale's office because Marcus Hale seemed like the kind of man who would want one. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The building around him hummed its ordinary hum. Somewhere above him, on the 12th floor, people were running recalculations and making phone calls and sitting with the particular discomfort of being in a room where something they'd built was being taken apart and examined. He was 32 years old. He had a master's degree he never used. He had a 7-year-old who knew the difference between cumulonimbus and altostratus. He had a thermos with a hairline crack. He had calloused hands and steel-toed boots that had been resoled twice. He had fixed the bridge. What happened next was someone else's problem to decide. He drank the cold coffee and waited. The formal incident report sat in Marcus Hale's inbox for 11 minutes before he opened it. Ethan knew this because Gerald told him, with the particular energy of a man who had been paying close attention to things he wasn't supposed to be paying close attention to. Gerald had a way of absorbing information through the building's walls, through the patterns of who called whom, which doors stayed closed longer than usual, which executive assistants moved through the corridors with the quick, tight walk of someone carrying urgent information. He had been doing this for 22 years. He was very good at it. Hale read it, Gerald said, settling into the chair across from Ethan's desk with the coffee he'd poured from the small machine in the corner. Then he forwarded it somewhere, I don't know where, but about 10 minutes after that, 2 people from legal showed up on 12. Ethan was eating a sandwich. The same turkey sandwich construction as always, made that morning in the 5 minutes between getting Maya's breakfast on the table and getting her out the door. He ate it without particular urgency. Legal from where? Internal or outside counsel? Internal. Ramirez and the other one, the younger woman, Patel. Gerald paused. That's not nothing. No, Ethan agreed. It's not. Gerald watched him eat for a moment. You don't seem particularly worried. I'm a little worried, Ethan said honestly. I just don't know what worrying harder would accomplish. The afternoon moved slowly. The maintenance office had the quality of a waiting room in which no waiting room music was playing, just the building's ambient sounds, the distant percussion of the ventilation system cycling, the elevator chime at irregular intervals. Ethan completed a software patch on the fire suppression monitoring panel, which took 40 minutes and required him to lie on his back under a ceiling access panel on the 3rd floor. He found it calming, the way physical detail work often was. The specific problem right in front of him, the clear measure of done and not done. At 2:15, his phone buzzed. A message from Marcus Hale's assistant. Mr. Hale would like to speak with you at 4 p.m. Conference room 6B, 2nd floor. 2nd floor, not the 12th. That was either a good sign or a very careful neutral one. He texted Mrs. Osei about Maya. She sent back a thumbs up and a photograph of her corgi, which was unrelated but appreciated. Marcus Hale arrived at 6B at 4:02 and sat down across from Ethan without ceremony, carrying a legal pad and a pen he didn't use. He was a compact man, fit in the way of someone who ran in the mornings out of discipline rather than enjoyment, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and the kind of face that had learned through decades of corporate navigation not to give too much away too fast. He looked at Ethan for a moment before he said anything. Paul Okafor finished his independent review, he said. He found the error. In the form you corrected it. He also found 2 additional propagation instances in the load distribution analysis that hadn't been caught yet, related to the same coefficient discrepancy. He paused. Your change to the file didn't catch those because they were in a separate sub-analysis section. Okafor caught them because he knew what to look for after your recalculation. Ethan said nothing. The client meeting Friday is canceled, Hale continued. Postponed, technically. We're citing internal review protocol. The actual reason is that we cannot, in good conscience, present a design with a known structural error to a consortium that's about to commit $100 million to it. He tapped the legal pad with the cap of the pen. That's the right call. It's also a significant setback for the company. I understand that. Do you? Hale's voice wasn't sharp. It was genuinely inquiring. Because I want to make sure you understand the full picture of what happened, not just the engineering part. He leaned forward slightly. This project has been Meridian's lead development effort for 3 years. The Crestline Consortium has been a relationship we've cultivated for longer than that. The postponement is manageable if it's brief And if we can demonstrate the review process caught the error internally, but the review didn't catch it internally. A maintenance technician caught it at 11 p.m. during a firmware update. He watched Ethan's face. That is a very complicated thing to explain. You don't have to explain it the way it happened, Ethan said. You could document it as an internal systems audit flag, which is technically accurate. Hale was quiet. I accessed the file during a systems update, Ethan said. The file flagged an integrity issue. I reviewed it. That's all within the scope of what I do. The fact that I understood what I was looking at is supplementary. You're offering to let us describe it vaguely. I'm pointing out that the description doesn't have to be inaccurate in order to be less complicated. Hale studied him. Why would you do that? After the way you were treated this morning? Ethan ate the last corner of his sandwich and folded the bag. Because the project getting fixed is what matters, not who gets credit for fixing it. Something moved through Hale's expression. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to recognition. The look of a man encountering a genuinely unfamiliar thing. How long have you been in maintenance? At Meridian, 3 years. Before that, 2 years at a facilities company that contracted for the city. And before that? Ethan looked at the table. Columbia, structural engineering. I finished my master's in 2016. I worked for a small firm in the city for about 14 months after graduation. Then I left. Because of your daughter. It wasn't quite a question. Hale had clearly done some reading in the hours since the morning meeting. Her mother left when Maya was almost 1, Ethan said. I needed a job with predictable hours and a stable schedule. Engineering project work doesn't run on those. Maintenance does. Hale absorbed this without comment for a moment. Then, the firm you worked for, after Columbia. Reston Partners, small outfit, 6 engineers. They primarily did municipal structural work. What did you work on there? Mostly bridge assessments, pre-existing structures, fatigue analysis, rehabilitation recommendations. Ethan paused. My thesis was thermal stress modeling in hybrid alloy suspension bridges. It's a fairly narrow specialty. Reston needed it for a city contract they'd picked up. When the contract ended, the specialty wasn't particularly useful to them anymore. They let you go. Budget decision? Yes. And you ended up in maintenance. Eventually, Hale made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He tapped the pen cap against the legal pad again. You've been walking past the Crestline project presentations in the hallways for 3 years. I've been walking past a lot of things, Ethan said. Did you ever think about... Hale stopped, reconsidered. Did you ever consider trying to get into the engineering division here? Ethan looked at him directly. On whose authority? The question landed. Hale received it without flinching, which told Ethan that he was a man who was capable of hearing uncomfortable things without deflecting. Fair, he said. They sat with that for a moment. Legal wants to speak with you tomorrow morning, Hale said. Standard procedure when there's an unauthorized file access, regardless of context. I want you to know that the framing going into that conversation is not adversarial. We're not pursuing a disciplinary action. We are trying to document what happened completely and protect the company's position if the consortium asks questions. Okay. I would recommend you bring the original incident report you sent this afternoon. It's thorough. Ramirez will appreciate that. Okay. Hale stood. He picked up the legal pad. Then he stopped and looked at Ethan with the expression of a man who was deciding whether to say the last thing on his mind. Ms. Grant read your report, he said. This afternoon. Ethan waited. She didn't say much when she read it, but she asked me one question after. Hale hesitated slightly. She asked me why someone with a master's in structural engineering from Columbia was working maintenance in our building for 3 years and nobody knew about it. Ethan held his gaze. What did you tell her? I told her I didn't know. He paused. Which is true, but I think I understand it a little better after this conversation. He tucked the legal pad under his arm. We'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Cole. He left. Ethan sat alone in 6B for a few minutes, listening to the building settle into its late afternoon rhythm. Then he packed up, clocked out, and went to get Maya. What? She had in fact started talking before she reached him. Dad, did you know that ice storms are technically not the same as freezing rain, even though they look the same? And the difference is the temperature of the air layer above the ground. And if the layer is cold enough, the rain freezes before it hits. And if it's not cold enough, it freezes when it lands. And Mrs. Kowalski didn't know that. He fell into step beside her and let her talk all the way to the corner, where he bought her a juice from the bodega, and she switched topics to a disagreement she'd had with a boy in her class named Derek about whether clouds were made of water or made of air, which she had won. "What did you have for lunch?" he asked. "The pasta thing. It was okay. There was too much oregano." "How do you know it was oregano?" She looked at him with the expression she'd developed recently, one of tolerant patience for adults who underestimated her. "Because oregano smells like pizza, and I smelled it." He nodded gravely. Solid methodology. She took his hand without fanfare as they crossed the street, which she only did now when she felt like it, the way 7-year-olds begin to ration their public affection as a new kind of currency. They made pasta at home that night, her choice, and he let her add the spices herself, which she did with extreme seriousness. After dinner, she sat at the kitchen table and finished her homework while he cleaned up, and he listened to her read her answers aloud to herself under her breath, the way she did when she was checking her own work. He put her to bed at 8:30. She was asleep before the audiobook timer ran out. He sat in the kitchen afterward with the light on and the window open a crack and thought about Hale's face when he'd said on whose authority, the way the question had landed. He thought about Okafor, about the careful neutrality on his face when the calculation confirmed, about the specific quality of that neutrality, the kind that comes not from indifference but from professional accountability, from the uncomfortable process of acknowledging something that should have been caught and wasn't. He thought about Isabella Grant asking why nobody knew. The question implied, not explicitly, but in its shape, that the answer mattered to her, that she was not simply filing the question away as an administrative curiosity, but sitting with it. He didn't know what to make of that. He knew almost nothing about Isabella Grant beyond the outline of her public profile and the 45 minutes they had occupied the same room that morning, most of which she had spent treating him like a problem to be managed. People like her, people who had built their careers on precision, on never letting anything get past them, tended to respond to being wrong in two specific ways. Some of them buried it, reassembled the narrative quickly, got the inconvenient facts into a shape that didn't require them to rethink anything fundamental. And some of them went the other direction. Let it hit them. Felt the full weight of having missed something. He didn't know yet which kind she was. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The legal meeting was at 9 Thursday morning. It lasted 90 minutes and was, as Hale had suggested, not particularly adversarial. Ramirez was precise and professional, Patel took detailed notes, and Ethan answered everything he was asked without embellishment. He described the access, the error, the correction, the documentation. He produced the incident report. He answered follow-up questions about the technical substance of the change. At 10:30, he was back in the maintenance office. At 11:15, Dennis Waite appeared in the doorway. Ethan looked up. Waite was a big man, well over 6 feet, broader than he appeared seated, and he filled the doorframe in a way that probably helped him in rooms where authority was established by physical presence. He was 60 or so, with the kind of career history that ran like a list of awards: 25 years of experience, multiple published papers, a named project in 4 states. He was the kind of engineer who had stopped having his work questioned somewhere in his mid-40s and had organized a significant portion of his professional identity around that fact. He was not entirely comfortable in this doorway. "You got a minute?" he said. Ethan gestured at the chair across from him. Waite came in and sat down. He didn't look around the maintenance office or register anything about it, which Ethan appreciated. It was the behavior of someone who was focusing on the reason they came, rather than the setting. Waite folded his hands on his knees and looked at a point somewhere near Ethan's shoulder. "Paul's review is done," he said. "The error is confirmed. The additional instances in the load distribution section are confirmed." A pause. "It's going to require significant rework on those sections. We're looking at 3 to 4 weeks minimum before we can present to the consortium again." "I know." Waite's jaw moved. Not chewing, processing. "The error originated in my team's work. The thermal analysis section was assigned to 2 of my junior engineers. I reviewed it. I signed off on it." He finally made direct eye contact. "I missed it." Ethan said nothing. I've been doing this for 25 years, Waite said. I have not missed something like this in a very long time. He said it not with self-pity, but with the factual precision of a man doing an honest accounting. The coefficient discrepancy is small enough that my review process, which is a process I designed for my team, wasn't calibrated to catch it, because the alloy specification cross-reference isn't part of the standard coefficient review checklist. He paused. It should be. It is now. Ethan looked at him. Okay. I'm not asking you to forgive anything, Waite said, slightly impatiently, as if he'd anticipated a different response and had to recalibrate. I'm explaining what happened on our end, because you deserve to understand the full picture. I appreciate that. Waite studied him for a moment. Your thesis, Columbia 2016. I looked it up this morning. Thermal differential analysis in modified high-tensile cable suspension systems. He said it with the particular quality of a man who knows enough to evaluate what he's citing. It was published in the Journal of Structural Engineering the following year. I remember seeing it. I didn't connect the name. There's no reason you would have. No. Waite uncrossed his hands and crossed them again. But I'm connecting it now. There was a pause between them that had a specific texture. The texture of two engineers who had been, in different contexts and for different reasons, inside the same problem. The cascade pattern in that coefficient error, Ethan said, because it was the thing he'd been thinking about since Tuesday night, and no one had yet discussed it with him as a technical matter. It wasn't random. The value propagated consistently because whoever sourced it used a single reference entry across all 4 sections rather than going back to the materials spec each time. That's a workflow issue, not a calculation issue. Waite was quiet. If the project review process treats each analysis section as standalone, you'll miss this category of error every time, Ethan said. The fix isn't adding a checklist item. It's building a verification step that cross-references the materials spec against every input table, not just the primary ones. Waite looked at him with an expression that Ethan couldn't fully decode, somewhere between professional respect and the slight discomfort of being taught something useful by a person you'd been dismissing 48 hours earlier. That's a systems change, Waite said. Yes. It would affect every active project's review protocol. That's probably appropriate, Ethan said, given that this isn't the first project that's used this workflow. The silence that followed was longer than the ones before it. Ethan could see Waite working through the implications, not just the technical ones, but the organizational ones, the internal review that would follow, the questions about other active projects. Right, Waite said finally. He stood. He looked like he was going to say something further, then seemed to decide against it and changed course. Thank you for your time. Sure. He reached the door and stopped. Didn't turn around fully, just enough. You're good at this, he said. Not warmly, not generously, just directly, the way engineers say things when they mean them. You're very good at it. Then he was gone. Ethan sat for a moment in the quiet. Through the small window, the service alley sat in the mid-morning light. The pigeon was back. He'd started to think of it as the same pigeon, though there was no rational basis for that assumption. She came to the maintenance office at 1:45 p.m. He heard her before he saw her. Not her footsteps, which were quiet, but the particular change in the ambient sound of the corridor outside, the way people adjusted when she moved through a space. A brief pause in a conversation somewhere down the hall. The slight acceleration of someone's footsteps moving out of a path. Isabella Grant appeared in the doorway. She was still in the charcoal suit, or one that was effectively identical. She was alone, which was notable. He had not seen her move through the building without an assistant in proximity before, though he had admittedly only observed her from a distance. She looked at the maintenance office the way Waite had not looked at it. She took it in, briefly but completely. The rolling chair, the toolboard on the wall, the small window, the institutional light. She did it without comment, but not without register. Do you have time? She said. Yes. She came in and sat in the chair across from his desk. She did it without asking if she could, and without any performance of comfort, just efficiently, like a person who sat in whatever chair was in front of them because chairs were functionally equivalent. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She looked at the corner of his desk, not at him, but near him, with the expression of a person who had prepared something and was finding, now that the moment was here, that the preparation didn't quite fit the room. "I owe you an apology," she said. Her voice was flat. Not cold, flat. The specific flatness of someone being very precise about something they find uncomfortable. Ethan waited. "I came into that meeting this morning with a conclusion already formed," she said. "Unauthorized access, alterations to a critical file before a major client presentation. Those facts have a clear interpretation, and I applied it. Without adequate information and without," she paused briefly, "without the basic courtesy of assuming good faith until I had reason otherwise." She looked at him directly now. "That was wrong. I want to say that plainly." Ethan held her gaze. He didn't rush to absolve her or minimize what she was saying, because that would have been its own kind of dishonesty. He let it sit there between them. "I also want to be honest about something else," she said. "Even if you had come to me through the appropriate channel, if you had sent Gerald an email or flagged it in a ticket or called the project line, I don't know with confidence that the information would have reached the right person in time, or that the right person would have acted on it if it came from," she stopped, "from someone in your role." "Probably not," he said. The directness of his agreement seemed to land on her. "I've been running this company for 3 years," she said. "I know what our systems are. I know their strengths. I think I was less honest with myself about their weaknesses than I should have been." "The system worked fine," Ethan said, "for the kind of error it was designed to catch. It wasn't designed to catch this one." "No, it wasn't." She looked at her hands briefly, then back at him. "Marcus told me about your background, your degree, your thesis." She paused. "Why didn't you disclose it when you were hired?" "Because I was applying for a maintenance position," he said. "The application didn't ask for graduate credentials. My experience was 5 years of facilities and systems work, which was what the role required. My engineering background wasn't relevant to whether I could do the job. It's relevant to whether we were using you correctly." "That wasn't my decision to make." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It was mine. And I didn't make it because I didn't know to make it." She said this without self-excuse, just precisely. "Which brings me to why I'm here." She straightened slightly. Not a performance, just the physical adjustment of a person who has finished the harder part of what they came to say and is moving to the next part. "The Crestline rework will take approximately 3 to 4 weeks, according to Waite's estimate. Paul Okafor has begun the revised thermal analysis. The additional sections that need correction have been identified." She paused. "When the rework is complete, it will need to be validated before we present to the consortium again. A full independent structural review of the corrected design." Ethan looked at her. "I want you to lead that validation," she said, "not as part of the existing project team. As an independent reviewer with full access to all project files, full authority to request additional analysis on any section, and full reporting rights directly to me." The maintenance office was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the building, an elevator chimed. "You'd be working alongside the engineering division," she continued, "not under it. Your findings supersede the project team's sign-off. Nothing goes to the consortium without your validation." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "That's a significant authority structure to build around someone you met yesterday," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She didn't apologize for it or soften it. "My current role," he said. "My hours. Negotiable. We'll work around your schedule." "I have a daughter," he said directly. "My schedule isn't negotiable in the way corporate schedules usually are. 3:30 pickups are not optional." She received this without expression change. "I understand." "You might understand it right now," he said, "and find it more complicated in 4 weeks when the consortium deadline is pressing." Her eyes steadied on him. There was something in them, not offense at being pushed back on, but a recalibration. The look of a person deciding in real time how much of themselves to be honest about. "That's a fair concern," she said. "I don't have a way to guarantee you that the pressure of a deadline won't create complications. What I can do is tell you that this conversation, what you just said, Will be in writing before you agree to anything." He held her gaze for a moment. "I'll think about it," he said. She nodded once. She stood, smoothing her jacket in the brief automatic way of someone who doesn't think about it. She looked at the door, then back at him. "One more thing," she said. "What you said this morning, in that room, about the thermal expansion, about the anchor housing, the way you laid it out." She paused, and for just a moment something in her composure moved. Not broke, not even softened, but shifted slightly, like the surface of still water when something passes beneath it. "You weren't nervous." It wasn't a question, but it had the shape of one. "I was a little nervous," he said honestly. She held his gaze for a second longer, then she turned and left. Ethan listened to her footsteps move down the corridor and fade. He sat in the maintenance office with the particular quality of silence that follows a significant thing and tried to work out what he felt about it. Not the job offers. That was complicated, and he'd think about it later, with more room to think. But the conversation itself, the apology she'd given him, which had been imperfect and clearly uncomfortable for her, and entirely genuine. The way she'd looked at the office, the way she'd said it was mine without looking away. He didn't know yet what kind of person Isabella Grant was. He had pieces. The boardroom version, the corrected version, the version that showed up alone in the maintenance office at 1:45 on a Thursday. None of them were complete. But she had come here herself. She hadn't sent Marcus or an assistant with a formal letter. She'd come to a room that wasn't her room and sat in a chair across from a person she'd spent a morning treating like a problem and said, "I was wrong." That wasn't nothing. He picked up his work order tablet. He had a cooling system diagnostic on 9 to get to before end of day, and then Maya, and then the question of what exactly he was going to do about an offer that could change his life in ways he hadn't fully worked out yet. He clipped the tablet to his tool bag and headed for the elevator. He thought about it for 4 days. Not constantly. He wasn't built for the kind of circular anxiety that turned a decision into a weather system you lived inside. He thought about it the way he approached most hard things, in the gaps. On the subway, while Maya slept and the apartment was quiet. While he ran the cooling diagnostic on 9, which turned out to have a blocked drain line rather than the compressor fault he'd expected, and the simplicity of a problem with a clean solution felt, for 20 minutes, like a small mercy. The offer sat with him the way unfamiliar weight sits. You feel it most when you shift positions. He called his sister on Friday night. Her name was Carmen. She was 36. She lived in Philadelphia with her husband and 2 boys, and she was one of the few people in his life with whom he was fully honest about things he found difficult. She had a directness that occasionally bordered on bluntness and a deep impatience for self-pity, which Ethan found consistently useful. "So say yes," she said before he'd finished explaining. "It's more complicated than that." "Is it? Or are you making it complicated because you've been telling yourself a certain story about your life for 3 years, and now someone's asking you to change it?" Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter. Maya was in bed. The window was open, and the city did its usual Friday night thing outside. Voices, a horn somewhere, a brief siren that faded east. "I'm telling myself a story about Maya," he said. "Not my life." "You can do both, Ethan. You are aware that humans do both. Not always successfully." "The CEO came down to your office personally. She sat in the maintenance chair. She said she was wrong." Carmen paused. "When does that happen? When does someone like that do that?" "Doesn't mean the working relationship will be functional. Nothing means anything will be functional. That's not a reason." He could hear her shifting on what was probably the couch. Could hear one of her boys saying something in the background that she shushed without breaking focus. "What does your gut say?" He thought about it honestly. "That I want to do it. That the bridge is a real problem, and I can solve it better than anyone else they have. That walking away from it would feel like what? Like putting the lid back on something." Carmen was quiet for a moment. "Ethan, you took the maintenance job because you needed stable hours, and you needed to be there for Maya. That was the right call at the time. Maya was one. She's 7 now. She doesn't need you the same way she needed you then. She needs a father who's present, yes. She also needs a father who's whole." Carmen's voice was careful but firm. "Those aren't the same thing." and you know it. You can be completely present for her and still be doing work that actually uses you. He didn't answer right away. You've been half disappearing for 3 years, she said. You did it for the right reasons, but Maya doesn't need you to keep disappearing. The city outside made its sounds. The refrigerator hummed. Ethan stood in his kitchen and understood, without quite admitting it fully yet, that his sister was right. The condition about the hours, he said. She said she'd put it in writing. Then get it in writing, Carmen said, and stop looking for reasons to say no to your own life. He told Isabella Grant yes on Monday morning. He came to the 12th floor at 8, which felt deliberate, before the day had settled into its usual shape, before the building had filled with the full weight of the week. Her assistant, whose name he'd learned was Linda, brought him to the corner office without the same cool processing she'd shown the first time. She knocked and opened the door in one motion. Isabella was at her desk, standing rather than sitting, reading something on a tablet. She was in navy today, a slight departure from the charcoal. She looked up when he came in. I'll do the validation review, Ethan said, under 3 conditions. She set the tablet down. All right. First, the hours commitment in writing, as discussed. 3:30 departure is non-negotiable, full stop. If a deadline creates pressure to change that, the deadline adjusts, not my schedule. Agreed. Linda will draft the terms today. Second, I work directly with Okafor, not through a project lead, not through Waite's chain of review. He and I have direct communication, and my findings go to you without being filtered through the engineering division hierarchy. She considered this for a fraction of a second. Agreed. Third, he paused. When the review is complete and the design is validated, I want a full written account of the error, its origin, and its correction placed in the permanent project record. Not a vague internal audit note, a complete technical account, with my name on the correction. Something moved across her face. A brief, specific tension, the look of someone encountering a condition they hadn't anticipated and were working through in real time. That creates a paper trail, she said. Yes, it does. For the consortium, for future audits, for anyone who ever pulls this project's documentation. Yes. She held his gaze. He could see the calculation behind hers, the organizational implications, the potential exposure, the alternative versions of how this story could be told with less institutional discomfort. He let her work through it without helping her. That's a significant ask, she said finally. It's accurate documentation, he said. If the bridge stands for 100 years, the record should show why it stands. If it had failed, he stopped. The record should show why it didn't. Another beat. Agreed, she said. He nodded once. She extended her hand across the desk, and he shook it. Her grip was firm without performance, the handshake of someone who didn't use the gesture as a display. Paul Okafor is expecting you at 9, she said. He asked to be the one to brief you in. Okay. He turned to leave. Her voice stopped him at the door. Mr. Cole. He turned. She was looking at him with the particular expression he'd seen once before. Not the CEO face, but the other one, the one that appeared briefly when the professional architecture shifted slightly. For what it's worth, the third condition. I think it's right. He looked at her for a moment. I know you do, he said. That's partly why I asked for it. He left before she could respond to that. Paul Okafor's workspace on the 7th floor was the organized chaos of a man in the middle of serious work. 3 monitors, a secondary drafting tablet, physical printouts of analysis sections spread across a side table in an order that looked random but almost certainly wasn't. He was 39, Nigerian-American, had done his PhD at MIT on composite material stress behavior, and had been at Meridian for 6 years. He was, Ethan had gathered from their brief interaction in the boardroom, someone whose professional pride ran deep and who had spent the 4 days since the error discovery in a state of focused self-correction rather than denial. He stood when Ethan came in and shook his hand with the directness of someone who had decided in advance how this meeting was going to go. I want to say something before we start, Okafor said. Okay. I've been on this project for 2 years. I reviewed Dennis's thermal analysis section when it came through for internal cross-check. I passed it. He said this steadily, looking at Ethan straight on. I should have caught the coefficient source discrepancy. I didn't. That's mine to own. The cross-check protocol isn't designed to flag source discrepancies, Ethan said. You reviewed what you were designed to review. I reviewed it without asking whether what I was given was fully accurate. Okafor's jaw tightened slightly. That's a different thing. I know better than to take input values at face value without going back to the spec. I've known better for 10 years. I got complacent. He paused. I'm telling you this because I want you to know that when you're doing this validation, I'm not going to be defensive. If you find something wrong, I want to know about it. Directly, not softened. Ethan looked at him. This was, he thought, the second person in 4 days who had walked into a room and offered him honesty without being asked for it. He didn't take it for granted. Okay, he said. Same from me. If I'm wrong about something, tell me. Okafor held his gaze for a second, then something in his posture released slightly. Sit down, he said. I'll walk you through where we are. They worked for 4 hours straight that first day. Okafor walked him through the revised thermal analysis, the corrected coefficient implemented across all affected sections, the additional propagation instances in the load distribution analysis that Okafor had caught in his independent review. It was thorough, careful work. Ethan asked questions at specific points, not to test Okafor, but because the questions were genuine, and Okafor answered them without the slight defensiveness that Ethan had half expected. By noon, they had established a working rhythm. Okafor knew the project's architecture better than anyone. Ethan knew the specific failure mode they were validating against. Together, the combination was efficient in a way that good collaborative work sometimes was, each person filling the gaps the other left without having to negotiate about it. At 12:15, Ethan said he needed to break for lunch. Okafor looked up from his secondary monitor. There's a decent sandwich place on 46th if you're going out. I brought something. Sure. Okafor paused. Ethan? He hadn't used the first name before. Can I ask you something that isn't about the project? Ethan waited. You've been in this building for 3 years. You clearly have. You understand this material at a level that most of our senior engineers would struggle to match, and you were doing firmware updates. He said it carefully, not cruelly. I'm trying to understand how that happens, how a person ends up there. Ethan considered the question. Life makes specific demands at specific times, he said. You meet them or you don't. I met them. The path I ended up on was the one that let me do that. Your daughter? Yes. Okafor nodded slowly. My wife and I have a son, he said. He's 4. There was a period 2 years ago when she was sick. Nothing permanent, but serious enough that I had to reconfigure everything for about 8 months. He looked at his desk. I've thought about what it would have looked like if it had gone differently, if I'd had to make different choices. He paused. I think I understand a little of what you're describing. It's not a tragedy, Ethan said. I want to be clear about that. I made choices that were right for my situation. I'm here now. Yes. Okafor looked at him. You are, Tansad. The work over the following 2 weeks had a texture that Ethan hadn't felt in a long time. The particular density of problems that required everything he had. Not just technical competence, but judgment. The kind that came from understanding not only what the numbers said, but what they meant, what they implied downstream, where the system was telling you something and where it was simply confirming what you already knew. He arrived at 7 and left at 4, without exception. The first time a rescheduling conflict was floated, a consortium progress call that the project team wanted him on at 4:30 on a Wednesday, he simply said he had a prior commitment and offered to send written notes. Marcus Hale, who was managing the consortium communication, confirmed the call time was moved to 3. Nobody made an issue of it. Maya noticed something had changed. Not loudly. She was observant rather than demonstrative, a quality she'd had since she was very small, the particular attentiveness of a child who had learned to read the room. She noticed the way he moved through their evenings with slightly more energy, the way he occasionally looked up from her homework checking and said something about forces and weight, structural things that she received with interest even when she didn't fully follow them. One night about a week in, she looked up from her drawing, horses, always horses, and said, Are you doing different work now? A little bit, he said. Is it more interesting? He considered the question with the seriousness she gave it. Yes. She went back to her drawing. Then, is it the bridge kind of work? He looked at her. How do you know about bridge work? You talked about bridges when I was little, when you were explaining to me about how things don't fall down. She added a detail to the horse's mane with her pencil. I remember. You said bridges are just weight and how you hold it. He sat with that for a moment. The image of himself, younger, sleep-deprived, sitting in this same kitchen with an 11-month-old who couldn't possibly retain anything he said, explaining the mechanics of suspension to her anyway because he needed to say it out loud to someone. Yeah, he said, it's the bridge kind of work. She nodded with the equanimity of a child for whom this was the expected and correct answer, and went back to her horse. Dennis Waite appeared in Okafor's workspace on the 9th day. Ethan was at the drafting table reviewing the revised anchor housing stress calculations when Waite knocked on the open door. Okafor looked up first. There was a brief, navigated silence between the two of them. The specific silence of colleagues who have spent a week reorganizing their professional relationship around a difficult event and haven't fully finished the reorganization. Mind if I take a look? Waite said, gesturing at the printouts on the table. Okafor glanced at Ethan. Ethan gestured toward the table. Waite came in and stood at the table, examining the revised calculations with his reading glasses pushed up from where they'd been on his chest. He was quiet for 3 minutes. Not performatively quiet, actually working through it. The revised anchor geometry, he said finally, pointing at a section. You've increased the housing circumference by 4%. The corrected thermal expansion requires it, Ethan said. At the accurate coefficient, the original housing geometry has insufficient clearance under peak cold weather contraction. 4% increase brings it within tolerance with a 15% safety margin. It changes the foundation anchor bolt pattern, Waite said. Yes. I've updated that section, page 12. Ethan indicated the sheet. Waite found it, read it. The bolt spacing increase adds approximately $60,000 in materials cost per anchor point. 6 anchor points on the northern approach, $360 total. Against a $100 million project. Against a bridge that doesn't fail in 2031, Ethan said. Waite looked at him. Something in his face had the quality it had the day he'd sat in the maintenance office chair, the uncomfortable honesty of a man doing ongoing self-accounting. The original housing geometry was mine, he said. My specification. I know. If the project had gone to construction with the original thermal value, the 4% clearance issue would have compounded the anchor stress problem. The failure timeline would have been faster than your initial estimate. By 2 to 3 years, roughly. Yes. Waite was quiet. The changes I've made are documented with source references in the revision log, Ethan said. Same approach as the coefficient correction. Transparent record of what changed and why. Waite took off his reading glasses and held them in one hand. I owe you something I haven't said yet, he said. You don't... Not gratitude, Waite said firmly. That's not what I mean. He looked at Ethan with the directness that had been present even when he was wrong. What I owe you is professional respect that I didn't give you in that boardroom. I treated your analysis as implausible before I looked at it, because of where you were sitting, not because of what you said. He paused. That's not how I was trained to evaluate engineering. It's not how I trained the people who work for me, and I did it anyway. He said it without self-dramatization, just precisely. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to hear me say it directly. The room was quiet. Ethan looked at him steadily. Thank you, he said. Not dismissively, not warmly, just received. The way honest things deserve to be received. Waite put his glasses back on and looked at the revised calculations for another moment. The housing change is correct, he said. I'll route the update through the materials procurement chain today. He left. Okafor waited until his footsteps had faded down the corridor, then looked at Ethan. That, he said, is the most I've heard Dennis Waite say anything like that in 6 years. He means it, Ethan said. I know he does. That's what makes it notable. On the 14th day, Isabella Grant came to the 7th floor. Not to Okafor's workspace specifically. She appeared in the corridor and knocked on the open door the way Waite had, which told Ethan that the 12th floor had developed a new relationship with knocking on open doors in the past 2 weeks. She was in black today, a slightly different cut from the usual suits, and she had the focused quality she always had, but with something underneath it that read as something closer to uncertainty than he'd seen before. "How's the review tracking?" she said. It was addressed to both of them, but her eyes moved to Ethan. "We're through the primary structural sections," Ethan said. "Anchor housing revisions are finalized. Load distribution rework is complete and validated. We have the cable tension reassessment left. That's 3, maybe 4 days. And then a full integrated review to confirm no additional propagation from the revised values. So 10 days to completion? 7 if the cable section comes in clean." She looked at the spread of printouts on the table, the way Waite had, with the informed attention of someone who understood enough of what she was looking at to know what she didn't understand. "Any surprises in the review?" she asked. "Beyond what we already identified." "One," Ethan said. "Minor. The wind load analysis for the midspan section used a regional wind data set that's 8 years old. The updated data set, released 2 years ago, shows slightly higher peak gust velocities for this corridor. The current design tolerances handle it, but barely. I'd recommend a modest increase in the deck stiffening specification before construction." Cost implication? "Okafor's running the estimate now. Initial read is under 200,000. She nodded. "At it." "It's outside the scope of the current error correction," Ethan said. "I know." She looked at him. "At it anyway. If we're rebuilding the confidence in this design, we do it completely." He held her gaze for a moment. "Okay." She looked at the table again, then back at him. There was a pause that had something particular in it. Not awkward, but weighted. "My assistant tells me you've been leaving at 4 every day," she said. Ethan waited. "I'm not raising it as a problem," she said, with a slight sharpness in her voice that was directed inward rather than at him, the tone of someone preempting a misreading. "I'm raising it because I want you to know it's been noted, that you've been hitting the workload you've been hitting and leaving at 4 and getting done what you're getting done." He considered this. "It's possible to do good work and also leave at 4, he said. "These things are not intention." Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. "I'm learning that," she said. She looked at the printouts one more time, with the expression of a person doing a private accounting of something. Then she straightened and said, 7 days, keep me informed if that changes." She left. Okafor looked at Ethan. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "She came down here herself. Again." "She does that," Ethan said. "I've been at this company 6 years, Okafor said. She has not, to my knowledge, ever come to the 7th floor for a project status update." Ethan pulled the cable tension analysis printouts toward him. "Let's get through this section," he said. Okafor watched him for a moment with an expression that was professionally neutral except for a slight quality around his eyes, the look of someone filing something away. They went back to work. Well, the validation review was completed on the 18th day. Ethan filed the final report on a Thursday evening at 3:15, which gave him enough time to walk out of the building and get to the school on 181st by 3:30. The report was 43 pages. It documented every section reviewed, every finding, every correction, every decision. The language was precise and technical and complete. The last section was titled Summary of Structural Integrity Status. He wrote, "The Crestline Bridge design, as revised per the corrections documented in this report, meets all applicable structural standards with appropriate safety margins across all load conditions, seasonal thermal ranges, and wind load scenarios consistent with current regional data. The design is validated for presentation to the Crestline Consortium and for construction." He sent it to Isabella Grant and Marcus Hale and Okafor. Then he shut down his drafting tablet, picked up his bag, and walked out into the corridor toward the elevator. The 7th floor had the slightly emptied quality of late Thursday afternoon, most of the desks clearing out for the weekend. Through the glass partition of Okafor's workspace, he could see Paul still at his desk, reading something on his monitor, coffee cup at his elbow. Ethan knocked twice on the glass. Okafor looked up. Ethan held up his hand in a brief acknowledgement. Not a wave, something more minimal than that. The gesture of two people who have worked closely through something difficult and have arrived, without ceremony, at the other side of it. Okafor nodded once. Ethan took the elevator down and walked out into the afternoon, where the October air had finally committed to being cold, the kind of cold that arrived in New York with the particular seriousness of a thing that intended to stay. He walked the 3 blocks to the subway with his canvas bag over his shoulder and his hands in his jacket pockets. The bridge was real now, not the bridge that had almost been wrong, the one that was right. He thought about 43 pages, about 18 days of careful work, about 6 anchor points and the corrected circumference of their housings and the revised bolt pattern and the $3,600,000 that would make them hold in February. He went down the stairs to the A train. He went to get his daughter. The consortium meeting was rescheduled for the first Tuesday in November. Marcus Hale sent the confirmation email on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday the 12th floor had taken on the particular compressed energy of a building preparing for something significant. Ethan felt it when he stepped off the elevator. The way voices carried differently, the way people moved through the corridors with slightly more purpose than usual, the way Linda at the executive reception desk had the phone to her ear before 8:30. He had been formally transitioned out of maintenance for the duration of the validation work. Gerald had handled the paperwork with his customary quiet competence and a handshake that lasted slightly longer than usual. But Ethan still came in through the lobby at 7:51, still walked the same path to the elevator, still carried the canvas bag. Some habits were structural. They held things together without you noticing until you tried to change them. He had a desk on the 7th floor now. It was a spare workstation near the window at the east end of Okafor's space. Not his own office, not a named position, but a place to put his things, which felt, in its modest way, like a statement about permanence. The 43-page validation report had gone to the consortium the previous Thursday. Their technical review team, 3 independent structural engineers retained by the consortium, had spent the intervening days going through it. Hale had told Ethan on Friday that the consortium's lead reviewer, a woman named Dr. Sarah Beckett, who had built her reputation on Hudson Valley infrastructure projects, had called the report the most thorough independent structural validation she had reviewed in 15 years. He had passed this along in the same neutral reporting voice he used for everything, but Ethan had noticed that Hale's posture was slightly less contained than usual when he said it. Ethan had said thank you and gone back to the wind load specification he'd been refining. Well, the consortium meeting was not something Ethan was scheduled to attend. He understood this without being told. The meeting was a client-facing presentation, led by Isabella Grant and Marcus Hale, supported by the project's senior engineers. It was not a technical review session. His work was in the 43 pages. The meeting was the next step, which was someone else's to manage. He spent Tuesday morning at the 7th floor workstation going through a preliminary file that Okafor had flagged, a new municipal project in the early proposal stage. A pedestrian bridge in Queens, nothing to do with Crestline, just the ordinary forward motion of a firm's work. He was checking the material specification cross-references, because that was now something he checked automatically and would probably check automatically for the rest of his career. At 10:15, Linda appeared at the entrance to the 7th floor workspace. Ethan looked up. "Ms. Grant would like you on 12, she said. "The consortium meeting has started." He put down the file. I'm not on the agenda." "No," Linda said. "She'd like you there anyway." He followed her to the elevator without further discussion, because there was no productive alternative. But the 12th floor conference room was fuller than it had been on the morning he'd stood in it and recited the thermal coefficient error to a room of people who hadn't wanted to hear it. The Crestline Consortium was 8 people, county officials, infrastructure committee chairs, a representative from the Federal Transportation Review Office. They were arrayed on one side of the long table. Meridian's team, Hale, Isabella, Okafor, Waite, 2 other engineers whose work had been part of the revised design, was on the other. When Ethan walked in, Isabella was mid-sentence. She paused, noted him with a brief glance, and continued without breaking her delivery. She gestured toward the empty chair at the near end of the Meridian side, and he sat in it. He had seen her present before, or rather he had watched her in the boardroom 3 weeks ago, under entirely different conditions. This was different. She moved through the material with the fluency of someone who had not only read the report, but absorbed it, who understood not just the facts, but the architecture of the argument. She explained the error discovery with a specificity that did not soften it. The coefficient source discrepancy, the propagation across related sections, the failure timeline under cold weather loading. She presented it as what it was, a problem that had been found and corrected before it caused harm. She did not minimize what had happened. She did not use language designed to make the consortium feel more comfortable than the facts warranted, and when she came to the correction itself, she said Ethan's name. The error was identified by Ethan Cole, our structural validation specialist, during a routine systems review of the project files. She said, Mr. Cole holds a master's in structural engineering from Columbia, specializing in thermal stress analysis and suspension structures. His correction was confirmed independently by our chief calculations engineer, Paul Okafor, within hours of discovery. The full validation review, completed over 18 days, was led by Mr. Cole. The consortium's lead reviewer, Dr. Beckett, was looking at Ethan across the table with the particular attentiveness of someone placing a face to a document they'd spent the past week reading. The 43-page validation report, she said. That's yours. Yes, Ethan said. The wind load section, the updated regional dataset recommendation. That was outside the scope of the original error correction. It was a finding from the review process, he said. It warranted inclusion. Beckett looked at him steadily. She was in her early 60s with gray-streaked hair and the calm certainty of someone who had stopped needing to prove herself somewhere in middle age. The updated specification will add approximately $180,000 to the materials cost. Correct. But the consortium's technical team ran the same calculation independently, she said. Same result. We're recommending acceptance of the revised specification. She looked briefly at Isabella, then back at Ethan. The report is exceptional work, she said. It was not said warmly or effusively. It was said the way engineers say things they mean, which was precisely and without decoration. Ethan held her gaze. Thank you. The meeting continued for another hour and 20 minutes. It was not without friction. The consortium's infrastructure chair, a man named Garfield, who had clearly arrived with a list of concerns and was not going to leave without addressing each one, had pointed questions about the review timeline and whether additional internal checks were now in place. Hale handled most of these. Waite handled one, explaining the updated cross-reference protocol his team had implemented for coefficient sourcing, the systemic fix Ethan had described to him 3 weeks ago, now institutionalized as a standard review step across all active Meridian projects. When Garfield pressed on whether the original error should have been caught earlier in the review process, there was a brief, tightened silence. It was Isabella who answered. Yes, she said. It should have been. The review process at the stage where this error existed had a gap that we have now closed. I won't dress that up as something other than what it is. She met Garfield's eyes without flinching. The error was found before any construction began. The design has been corrected and validated. The review process has been strengthened. That's the full account. Garfield looked at her for a moment and then wrote something on his notepad. It was not a comfortable moment. Isabella did not try to make it one. The consortium voted at the end of the meeting, 7-1 in favor of approving the revised crestline design and proceeding to construction. The dissenting vote was Garfield, who said he wanted a second independent validation from an outside firm before he was personally comfortable. This was noted, logged, and agreed to. A second external review would be commissioned and completed within 30 days before the construction contract was executed. As people began gathering materials and pushing back chairs, Dr. Beckett moved around the table toward Ethan. She stopped beside him and lowered her voice. Are you at Meridian permanently now? She asked. That's being discussed, he said honestly. I'm on the Infrastructure Advisory Board for the Metropolitan Planning Commission, she said. She handed him a card, actual physical cardstock, which was unusual enough to register. We have a review project in the early stages, Hudson Valley Coastal Barrier Assessment. Thermal differential analysis is a significant component. She paused. I'd like to have this conversation at some point. I'll call you, he said. She nodded and moved away. Ethan held the card for a moment, then put it in the breast pocket of his jacket. He found Isabella in the corridor outside the conference room afterward. She was speaking briefly with Hale, and when Hale moved away, she turned and almost walked into Ethan, who had not quite anticipated being directly in her path. She stepped back. They were close enough that he could see the slight tension she was carrying in her jaw, the controlled release aftermath of a high-stakes hour. "Good meeting," he said. "Adequate meeting," she said. "Garfield is going to be a problem through the construction phase." "He's doing his job." "Yes. Poorly, but yes." She looked at him with the direct quality that was her baseline. "Why didn't you push back when he was pressing on the review timeline? You could have." "It wasn't my place in that room." "You were the one who—" "I know what I did," Ethan said. "That room was yours to run. I wasn't going to complicate it." She looked at him. There was something in her expression that he'd started to recognize over the past weeks. A slight adjustment, like a lens refocusing. She did it when he said something that didn't fit the model she was still, in some corner of her thinking, applying to him. He didn't say this. He just watched it happen. "I want to talk about what comes next," she said. "Okay." "Not here." She glanced at the corridor, which had a small but present traffic of people clearing out of the post-meeting movement. "My office. 4 o'clock?" "I have to leave at 4. A brief pause. 3:30, she said. "Fine." Ushti check. Her office at 3:30 had the quality of a space that had been organized by someone who knew exactly where everything was and needed it that way. Clean desk. One framed photograph he couldn't see the subject of from where he sat. A single plant on the windowsill that was the unsentimental kind of plant that survived on minimal attention. The window behind her desk faced west, and the afternoon light came in at a low angle, putting half the room in amber and half in ordinary office light. She came in 2 minutes after him, which he understood meant she'd had something to finish first. She sat. He sat. She opened a folder on her desk and looked at it briefly, then closed it and looked at him instead. "The second external review that Garfield pushed for," she said. "It's going to happen regardless. I want you to be available to the external reviewers as a reference. You're the most complete source on the corrected design. If they have questions, I'd like them to be able to come to you directly." "That's fine." The construction contract, once it executes, runs approximately 22 months. During construction, there will be a series of field validation reviews, structural checks at key milestones to confirm the built structure matches the design specifications. Those are typically done by the project engineer of record. She looked at him. "I'd like you to be present for those reviews, not leading them. You'd be working alongside the project engineer, but present." "That's a significant ongoing time commitment," he said. "Compensated accordingly." "It's not the compensation I'm questioning, it's the structure." He leaned forward slightly. "What are you actually asking me to do here? Because this sounds like you're building a role around a series of specific tasks, which is a different thing from hiring me into a defined position." She held his gaze. "I'm asking you to stay," she said, "in whatever structure makes sense for you. The specific tasks are the scaffolding. The actual ask is that you don't disappear back into the building's systems." "You could hire me into the engineering division," he said. "Okafor's team." "I could. I'm also aware that structural engineering positions at your level have specific demands that may not be compatible with my hours. With the way the work tends to be organized," she said carefully. "Project-based engineering work has surge periods, deadlines that don't respect 3:30. So you're offering me something outside that structure." "I'm trying to," she said, with the slight sharpness that appeared in her voice when she was being frustrated by something she couldn't quite resolve. "I'm trying to create something that actually works for you rather than offering you a standard template that sounds good until the first project deadline and then becomes a source of conflict." She paused. "I'm doing this imperfectly. I'm aware of that." Ethan looked at her. Outside her window, the afternoon light was doing something particular with the midtown skyline, the glass towers catching it at oblique angles, each building a slightly different shade of gold and copper and gray. "What I want," he said, "is to do work that matters and be home at 3:30. I've wanted that for 3 years, and I stopped believing I could have both because the structures around me said I couldn't." She listened without interrupting. "If you're telling me you can build a structure where both are possible," he said, "then I'm interested. But I need it to be real, not a good faith promise that erodes under the first significant pressure." I know. You said that before, he said. I'm saying it again because I need you to hear it differently this time. Not as a reasonable concern I'm raising, as a condition of the whole thing. A longer pause. What would make it feel real to you, she asked. Not defensively, genuinely. He thought about it. A defined role with written scope, he said. Not structural validation specialist as a placeholder title. An actual position with responsibilities, compensation, and explicitly protected hours. Not in my contract as a footnote, as a primary term. Done. And when the first deadline crunch comes, and it will, the escalation path is to you, not to whoever's managing the project in the moment. If someone pushes my hours, I go to you directly. She considered this for a second. That's an unusual reporting structure. Yes, but it's the one that makes the protection real. If the person who can override it is 2 levels away from me in the hierarchy, the protection is theoretical. She absorbed this. He could see the organizational thinking behind her eyes, the mapping of how this fit into Meridian's structure, the implications for precedent, the questions it would raise from other employees. You're worried about precedent, he said. A little, she admitted. Then think of it this way, he said. If the flexibility I'm asking for were offered as standard practice across your engineering division, would that be a bad thing? The question landed. She didn't answer it immediately, which meant she was taking it seriously rather than deflecting it. No, she said finally. Probably not. Then the precedent you'd be setting isn't a liability, he said. It's just a change. She looked at him with the lens refocusing quality again, except this time it was stronger. He'd come to think of it as the look that meant she was encountering the gap between the model she'd built of him and the actual person, and choosing, each time, to adjust the model. I'll have the contract drafted this week, she said. You review it. You tell me what needs to change. We go back and forth until it's right. He nodded. She tapped the closed folder on her desk. Then, as if making a separate decision, there's one more thing. Okay. When the bridge is complete, she said, Meridian will hold a project completion event. Typically, these are client and company affairs. Consortium officials, senior engineering staff, Meridian partners. She paused. I want you there, not as ancillary staff, as the person whose name is on the validation record. He looked at her. You earned that, she said. The record will show it. The event should show it too. Something about the directness of this, the absence of any softening or qualification, landed differently than he expected. He wasn't accustomed to being accounted for in that particular way, the way that said you were there. It mattered. People should know. All right, he said. She nodded once. The meeting was effectively over, and they both understood this. She opened the folder again and turned her attention to the next thing on her desk. Not dismissively, just functionally, the way she moved through the world. He stood and picked up his bag. At the door he stopped, not quite deliberately. Isabella. She looked up. He had not used her name before. They had been operating in the careful formality of people who had met under difficult conditions and were still navigating what the relationship between them was. The question you asked Hale, he said, when he told you about my background. You asked him why nobody knew. She held his gaze steadily. I've been thinking about that question, he said. I think the answer is that nobody looked. Not because the information was hidden, because the category of person I appeared to be didn't prompt the question. He paused. I'm not saying that to indict you specifically. I'm saying it because it's worth knowing. The system that kept me invisible wasn't malicious. It was just structured around certain assumptions about where capability lives, and those assumptions are expensive. She received this without looking away. He could see it hitting something genuine, but not guilt, which would have been easier, but the harder thing. The reckoning that came from looking at a structure you'd built and understanding its blind spots for the first time. I know, she said quietly. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he turned and left. Tit. Gerald was in the maintenance office when Ethan came to clear out the last of his personal items. The bodega coffee he'd forgotten, his spare jacket, the small tool reference manual he kept in his bottom drawer even though he hadn't needed to consult it in years. Gerald watched him with the expression of a man containing several things he wanted to say. You're not coming back here, Gerald said. No. Ethan folded the jacket. Probably not. Gerald nodded slowly. He looked at the small window with the service alley and the pigeon's ledge, which was currently empty. 22 years I've been in this office, he said. You know how many people I've watched come through this building? A lot. A lot. Gerald looked back at him. You were different from the first week. I didn't know how. I just knew. He paused. I want you to know I'm glad it worked out the way it worked out. Even though I'm going to have to hire someone new for the 11th floor server room, and nobody's going to understand that system like you did. Ethan picked up the coffee cup. The drain line issue in the 9th-floor cooling unit, there's a structural reason it keeps blocking. It's the angle of the secondary feed pipe. It's 3 degrees too shallow for the flow rate. Someone needs to repipe it properly, or it'll be a recurring problem. Gerald blinked. You couldn't have told me this 3 months ago? I kept meaning to, Ethan said. Write it up and I'll send you a proper note on it. Gerald shook his head, though not with displeasure. He stood and held out his hand. Ethan shook it, the same grip as on the first day, firm and real. Go build the bridge, Gerald said. Ethan picked up his canvas bag. It was 3:18. He had 12 minutes to get to the subway. He went to get his daughter. The contract arrived in his email Friday evening, while Maya was doing her homework and he was making rice at the stove. He read it on his phone, scrolling through the terms with one eye on the rice. The protected hours were on page 2, listed as a primary term in the employment conditions section, exactly as he had asked. The title was Senior Structural Validation Engineer. The compensation was the kind of number that took him a moment to fully register. He put his phone down and stirred the rice. Maya looked up from her homework. What? Nothing, he said. She studied him with the attentiveness he'd given her whether he'd intended to or not. You have the face you make when something is actually something, she said. He looked at her across the kitchen, this 7-year-old with her mother's eyes and her own particular way of seeing the world. I got a new job, he said. She considered this. At the same building? Same building. Is it more of the bridge work? Yes. Mom, she nodded with the equanimity she brought to everything important. Then, does the bridge have a name? Crestline, he said. They're calling it the Crestline Bridge. She tried the word out quietly. Then, can we see it when it's done? He turned back to the rice. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing its evening thing. Lights coming on in the towers across the way, the specific low hum of 10,000 concurrent lives. Yeah, he said. We'll go see it when it's done. The second external review came back clean. Dr. Beckett's independent team had spent 3 weeks going through the revised Crestline design, not just the corrected sections, but the full structural package end to end. Their report was 27 pages and concluded with a single sentence that Marcus Hale read aloud in the Monday morning briefing. The Crestline Bridge design, as validated by Meridian Structural Group's internal review dated October 18th, represents sound engineering practice and is recommended for construction approval without reservation. Garfield voted yes. The construction contract was executed on a Wednesday in late November, and Ethan sat in the 12th floor conference room for that signing, not at the table, but at the periphery, against the wall, the way he had always occupied the edges of rooms that weren't quite his yet. He watched Isabella sign her name across the bottom of the contract with the same contained precision she brought to everything, and he felt something settle in his chest that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief, but lived somewhere between the two. On the drive home that evening, he'd finally replaced the subway commute with a second-hand Civic he'd bought in October because the new salary made certain things possible that hadn't been before. He called Carmen. It's done, he said. The signing? The signing. She made a sound on the other end of the line that was warm and uncomplicated. How do you feel? He drove through the evening traffic on the West Side Highway, the Hudson to his left going dark under the November sky, the Jersey side lit up across the water. Like something that was supposed to happen finally happened, he said. I know that's not a satisfying answer. It's an honest one, she said. That's better. The 22 months of construction were not smooth. Nothing real ever was. There were weather delays in January, When a cold snap came early and froze the riverbank site harder than the geological survey had anticipated, pushing the foundation anchor installation back by 3 weeks. There was a materials procurement issue in March, the modified high-tensile alloy for the anchor housings, the specific alloy whose thermal coefficient had been at the center of everything, came from a single specialized manufacturer in Pennsylvania, and a production backlog put the delivery 4 weeks behind schedule. There was, in August of the following year, a disagreement between the site construction manager and the project engineer of record about the sequencing of the cable installation that turned, briefly and unpleasantly, into a formal dispute that had to be resolved in a meeting on the 12th floor. Ethan was present for the field validation reviews at the key milestones: foundation completion, anchor housing installation, primary cable tensioning, deck laying. He drove to the site on those days, stood on the riverbank in whatever the weather was doing, and watched the structure emerge from the ground and the river with the specific attention of someone who knew every calculation behind every piece of it. The anchor housings went in on a cold March afternoon, 2 weeks after the materials delay resolved. Ethan stood on the northern bank and watched the installation crew set the first housing into the foundation with the careful precision of people who knew what they were handling. Okafor was beside him, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the same thing. 4% larger, Okafor said quietly, than the original specification. Yes. Nobody looking at it would know why. No, Ethan said. They wouldn't. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Around them the site noise continued, the grinding of equipment, the voices of the crew, the river doing its indifferent thing beyond the bank. My son asked me what bridges are made of, Okafor said. Last week. He's 5 now. What did you tell him? Steel and concrete. He paused. And then I thought about this and I told him, also decisions. He didn't understand that part, but I wanted to say it. Ethan looked at the anchor housing sitting in its foundation, the modified circumference holding all the corrected math inside it like a sealed letter. That's a good answer, he said. Isabella came to 2 of the field validation reviews. The first time was the cable tensioning milestone, 8 months into construction. She arrived in site gear, hard hat, high-vis vest, boots that were clearly new and slightly too stiff, and stood at the edge of the work zone with Marcus Hale, watching the primary cables go up. She didn't insert herself into the technical conversation. She observed, asked one specific question about the tensioning sequence that showed she had been reading the technical briefings rather than just receiving them, and left after 2 hours. The second time was the deck completion milestone, 14 months in. By then the bridge had taken on its full shape. The towers standing against the winter sky, the cables spreading from them in the particular geometry of suspension that always looked from a distance like something drawn rather than built. The deck ran its length between the banks, and standing on the northern end you could look straight across to the southern shore and understand, in a physical way, you couldn't from a drawing, the scale of what it meant to hold something in the air across open water. Isabella stood at the northern end of the completed deck and looked south without speaking for a long time. The wind off the river was cold and direct. She had gotten better at sight gear by then. The boots were broken in, the hard hat worn with the slightly forward tilt of someone who had spent enough time on construction sites to stop being conscious of wearing it. Ethan stood beside her. Not close. A few feet away, the natural spacing of 2 people looking at the same thing. How does it feel? She asked. Which part? Standing on it. He thought about this honestly. Different than I expected, he said. More ordinary. It's concrete and steel and cable. It's just a structure. That's not the whole answer, she said. She wasn't looking at him, still facing south along the deck. No, he said. It's not. He looked at the cables, the way they spread upward from the deck to the towers, the way the tension ran through them like a held breath. It feels like something that was almost wrong and isn't. That's harder to explain than it sounds. She turned to look at him then, and he saw something in her face that he'd only seen in pieces before. The thing beneath the precision, the thing that ran underneath the CEO architecture she wore as naturally as the suits. It was something human and unresolved and genuine, and she let him see it for a moment without managing it away. I owe you more than an apology, she said. I've been thinking about how to say that for a long time. You don't... Let me finish. She said it without sharpness, just firmly. What I did in that boardroom, the way I came into it, the way I'd already decided, that wasn't just a mistake about you specifically. It was something I'd been doing for a long time without knowing I was doing it. Looking at people and seeing the category first, the title, the clearance level, the office versus the maintenance cart. She paused. I built my career on precision, on not missing things, and I was missing people right in front of me because I wasn't looking at the right data. The wind moved across the deck. I've been thinking, she continued, about how many Ethan Coles there are in buildings I walk through. People I pass in the lobby or the corridor or the service elevator, and I don't ask, I don't wonder, because the structure I've built doesn't prompt me to. She looked back out across the bridge. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. No, he said, it isn't. I don't have a clean resolution to offer you on that, she said. I'm working on it. It's a process, not a moment. He looked at her. The honest imperfection of what she'd just said, the admission that she didn't have a neat ending to hand him, that the change she was describing was ongoing and incomplete, was the most real thing he'd heard her say since the day she sat in the chair in the maintenance office and said it was mine. That's enough, he said. She held his gaze. The process is enough, he said. Clean resolutions are for people who don't understand how structures work. Things change incrementally, underload over time. That's not a flaw. That's just how it goes. She looked at him for one more second. Then she turned back to the bridge, and something in her posture, the held-in quality she carried everywhere, released by a small but perceptible degree. They stood on the completed deck in the winter wind and looked at the structure they had each, from completely different angles and for completely different reasons, helped bring to this moment. The Crestline Bridge opened on a Saturday in late March, 22 months and 1 week after the construction contract was signed. The opening was a public event, a morning ribbon cutting with the county officials and the consortium representatives, a brief ceremony with speeches, a crowd of a few hundred people who had followed the project through local news coverage and come out on a cold, clear morning to watch a bridge become a bridge. Ethan stood near the back of the official group during the ceremony, next to Okafor, who had his son on his shoulders. The boy, whose name was Kofi, who had his father's focused eyes and apparently had recently developed an obsession with construction equipment, kept pointing at the cranes that were still present at the site margins and saying that one in a decisive way that seemed to indicate he'd already chosen his favorite. The speeches were not short. Garfield, who had eventually been won over by the second external review and had since positioned himself as a champion of the project's rigorous safety standards, spoke for 11 minutes. The consortium chair spoke for 7. Marcus Hale said a few sentences on behalf of Meridian that were diplomatically precise and thanked the engineering team by collective noun rather than individual name, which was probably the right call for a public ceremony. Isabella spoke last. She was not a person who used speeches as a vehicle for performance. She stood at the podium in a charcoal coat, always some variant of charcoal, he'd noticed, as if she'd found the color that suited her and made a permanent decision, and spoke for 4 minutes. She talked about the project in technical terms first, the span, the load capacity, the safety margins. Then she talked about what the bridge would do for the 2 counties it connected, the commute times, the economic access, the 40 years of infrastructure that the people who drove over it would receive without ever thinking about where it came from. Then she said, every structure we build carries the decisions that went into it. Not just the engineering decisions, the human ones. Who we listened to, who we believed, who we were willing to be wrong in front of. She paused briefly. This bridge carries some of those decisions, the ones that were made correctly and the ones that were initially made incorrectly and then corrected. Both kinds are in it. I think that's true of every real thing we build. She didn't look at Ethan during this. She didn't need to. After the ribbon was cut and the crowd began to move forward onto the deck, Okafor lifted Kofi down from his shoulders and held his hand, and they walked out onto the bridge together, the boy pulling forward with the urgency of children who have been waiting for things to start. Ethan stood at the threshold for a moment. He had spent, if he calculated it roughly, approximately 240 days thinking about this bridge, from the Tuesday night in the server room to the field validation reviews to the contract and the construction milestones to this morning. He had done work on it that no one else in that room fully understood the depth of, in the way that certain precise work is like that, the most important parts invisible in the final product. He stepped out onto the deck and walked. The bridge was solid in the way that well-built things were solid, not in a way you had to concentrate on, but in a way your body understood immediately. The deck carried you evenly, the cables above running their geometry against the sky, the river below gray and wide and entirely indifferent to what human beings had stretched across it. He walked to the center and stopped. He put his hand on the railing and looked down at the water. The Hudson moved the way it always moved, with the slow insistence of something that had been going in one direction for a very long time and intended to keep going. On both banks, the land was present in its ordinary way, trees just starting to show the first tentative signs of spring, the industrial fringe of the river corridor giving way to suburban development as the eye moved inland. He stood there for a minute, maybe two. He wasn't counting. He thought about the anchor housings 6 feet below the deck surface, the modified circumference holding the corrected math inside it. He thought about the coefficient, 0.000086, the number he'd known and the number that had been wrong. The specific decimal that separated a bridge that lasted from a bridge that didn't. He thought about Paul Okafor saying also decisions to his 5-year-old son, and he thought that was about as accurate a definition of a bridge as he'd ever heard. He thought about Carmen telling him to stop looking for reasons to say no to his own life, about Maya in the kitchen asking if it was the bridge kind of work, about Gerald saying, "Go build the bridge," and shaking his hand for the last time in the maintenance office. He thought about 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in a server room, a rolling stool, a cold thermos, a number on a screen that wasn't right. He took his hand off the railing. Well, Maya was waiting at the south end of the bridge. He had arranged to meet her and Mrs. Osei there after the ceremony. Maya had been at school for a half day because there was a science presentation she refused to miss, something about precipitation cycles that she had been preparing for 3 weeks, and she'd been insistent that the timing work out so she could still come. Mrs. Osei had picked her up and driven the 40 minutes to the site, because Mrs. Osei had known Ethan for 3 years and understood that some things needed to happen correctly. He saw them from the middle of the bridge, Mrs. Osei, with her coat collar turned up against the wind, and Maya beside her, wearing her red jacket, looking up at the bridge the way she looked at her weather diagrams, with complete, unhurried attention. She saw him when he was about 30 yards away and started toward him at the half run that she'd used since she was old enough to cover ground quickly. She was 8 now, had grown 2 inches in the past year, had lost the last of the baby teeth she'd been losing slowly for 2 years, and the new front teeth were still slightly large for her face in the way that children's permanent teeth were for a while before their faces caught up. She stopped in front of him and looked up at the bridge and then at him. "We're on it," she said. It wasn't exactly a question, more a confirmation of something she was working out. "We're on it," he said. She looked back up at the cables, following the line from deck to tower with her eyes, the way she tracked weather systems, comprehensively, going from one point to the next until she had the whole thing mapped. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "Most things are," he said. She took his hand without ceremony, and they walked the remaining length of the deck to the northern end, then turned and walked back. She didn't talk for most of it, which was unusual enough for him to notice. She was thinking about something he could tell. The particular quality of her silence when she was assembling information. Near the center again, she stopped and looked down at the water the same way he had. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "If you hadn't fixed it," she was still looking at the water. "If you'd just closed the file and gone home." He looked at her profile. The small, serious face, the gap in her front teeth that the new teeth had now mostly closed, the focused way she had of looking at things she wanted to fully understand. "The bridge would have been built anyway," he said, "with the wrong number in it. And then what would have happened?" He thought about how much truth was the right amount of truth for an 8-year-old standing on the thing in question. He decided she deserved the real answer. "Eventually it would have started to fail," he said. "Slowly, in a way that might not have been obvious at first. And at some point it would have become dangerous." She absorbed this. People could have gotten hurt. Yes. She was quiet for another moment. Then, "Were you scared when you fixed it?" He thought about the rolling stool and the cold thermos and the particular silence of a server room at 11 p.m. "Not then," he said honestly. "A little scared the next morning, in the boardroom." "Because they yelled at you?" "Because they'd already decided I was wrong before I got there," he said. "That's a hard room to walk into." She turned and looked up at him directly. "But you walked in anyway." "I walked in anyway." She nodded, with the expression she got when she'd arrived at the conclusion she was working toward. Then she squeezed his hand once and let go and started walking again, back toward Mrs. Osei at the south end. He walked beside her. The bridge held them evenly. Isabella was at the north end of the bridge. He hadn't expected to see her there. He'd thought the official party had moved to the reception that the consortium was hosting at a facility half a mile from the site. But she was standing at the northern railing, alone, looking south along the length of the deck. She had the particular stillness of a person who has sent everyone away in order to have a moment that was just for them. He almost walked past. The moment felt private enough that interrupting it seemed wrong, but she saw him when he was 10 feet away and didn't look away, which he took as an indication that she was willing to have the moment interrupted. He stopped beside her. She was looking at the bridge the way you looked at something you'd had a hand in and were still accounting for. Not with pride exactly, with the more complicated thing that came after pride, when the accomplishment had cooled enough to see its actual shape. "Kofi liked the cranes?" Ethan said. Something in her expression shifted, the faintest adjustment in that direction of not quite a smile. "Paul told me. He said the boy has strong opinions about equipment." "He does." She looked back out over the bridge. "Garfield said something to me after the ceremony," she said. "He said he wanted to apologize for the extra review requirement. Said, in retrospect, it was an obstacle." "It wasn't," Ethan said. "No, I told him the same thing. If anything—" She paused. The second external review confirmed the validation. It gave the consortium confidence in the design they might not have fully had otherwise. The extra 3 weeks were worth it. "Garfield was doing his job," Ethan said. "He just did it loudly." She looked at him sidelong. "You're very generous to people who made your life difficult." "I'm not generous," he said. "I'm accurate. There's a difference." A pause. The river wind moved across the deck. "I had a call this morning," she said, "before the ceremony, from the National Infrastructure Review Board." She turned to look at him fully. "They're developing a new safety standard for suspension bridge thermal analysis protocols. A federal framework, something that would apply to all publicly funded suspension bridge projects nationally." She paused. "They want to model it on the Crestline validation methodology. They've been reading the 43-page report." Ethan held her gaze. "They want to speak with you," she said, "not as a Meridian representative, as the engineer who developed the methodology." Something passed through him that was neither small nor easy to name. Not pride. That wasn't quite it. More like the specific feeling of something that had started in a server room at 11 p.m., alone, without witness, reaching a size it was never supposed to reach. The coefficient error he had fixed for the bridge it would affect, becoming a protocol that would affect every bridge. The private act becoming, by some improbable chain of consequences, a permanent thing. "When?" he said. "They'd like to schedule something in the next few weeks." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a card, a government card, a name and a number. She held it out to him. "I told them I'd pass the contact along and that the conversation was yours to have, not mine." He took the card. "It's your work," she said. "It should be your conversation." He looked at the card. Then he put it in his pocket beside the one Dr. Beckett had given him 6 months earlier. The Metropolitan Planning Commission Infrastructure Advisory Board card that he'd followed up on in January and which had led to 2 consulting conversations and a standing invitation to review preliminary specifications on Hudson Valley projects. The pockets of his coat were filling up with things that his canvas work bag never had. "There's something I want to tell you," she said. Her voice had changed, dropped slightly, lost the professional register. "Not as your employer, just as—" She stopped, reconsidered. "As someone who's been thinking about this." He waited. When I came into that boardroom, she said, I was certain. Not about you specifically. I didn't know enough about you to be certain about anything. I was certain about the situation. Unauthorized access, critical file alteration before a major client presentation. Those facts assembled themselves into a narrative, and I committed to that narrative before you'd said a word. She looked at the bridge. I've run this company for 3 years. I've made a lot of decisions. Some of them have been wrong. But most of the time when I've been wrong about something, there was at least a real argument on both sides, and I just chose the wrong side. She paused. That morning wasn't that, she said. That morning I didn't even look for both sides. I had a maintenance worker in a boardroom, and the situation had already decided itself. She was quiet for a moment. That's something I've had to sit with, not as a professional lesson, as a personal one. The river moved below them. I'm telling you this, she said, because I think you deserve to know it's not a thing I've filed away and moved past. It's a thing that changed something in how I look at the building I run, the people in it. She paused. I'm not asking you to validate that or tell me it's okay. I just needed to say it to your face. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The wind off the river was in her hair. She'd gone without the tight, professional arrangement today, just the coat collar turned up and the hair doing what the wind suggested. She looked, in this moment, like a person rather than a function. I know you mean that, he said. How? Because you came to the maintenance office, he said. You could have sent Hale. You came yourself, and you sat in the chair. He paused. People who are managing optics send Hale. You came because you needed the conversation to be real. She held his gaze and didn't say anything for a moment. For what it's worth, he said, the thing you're describing, the structure that made that morning possible, it's not yours alone. It's everywhere. It's in how buildings are organized and how titles work and which rooms people are invited into and which ones they're assumed not to belong in. He looked at the bridge. The value wasn't hidden. It was just somewhere nobody thought to look. He paused. That's fixable. Slowly. Under load. Over time. She absorbed this in the way she absorbed difficult things, fully, without rushing it away. I want to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically. Okay? If the situation were reversed, if you had been in my position that morning and I had been in yours, would you have done the same thing I did? He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know, he said finally. I'd like to say no, but I don't know what I don't know about my own assumptions until they're tested. He paused. That's the honest answer. She nodded slowly. That's the right answer, she said. That's why it's a process. They stood on the bridge for another few minutes, not talking. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had been through something difficult together and arrived, imperfectly and over considerable time, at a place that felt different from where they'd started. Below them, the Hudson ran south toward the harbor. Above them, the cables held their geometry against the March sky. Duchet. Maya was waiting at the south end with Mrs. Osei, eating something, a granola bar that Mrs. Osei had produced from her bag with the efficiency of a woman who had been keeping children fed for 40 years. She waved when she saw him coming and then went back to the granola bar, which suggested the wave was acknowledgement rather than urgency. He came off the bridge and walked toward her. She looked past him briefly, toward the north end of the bridge where he'd come from, with the observational quality she'd always had. She didn't ask anything. She was 8, but she had her father's habit of looking at things carefully and deciding later what to say about them. Mrs. Osei patted his arm as he reached them. Beautiful bridge, she said. My Norman would have liked it. He was an engineer too, highway division. I didn't know that, Ethan said. 40 years ago. Different kind. She looked at the bridge with the measuring eyes of a woman who had been married to an engineer for 30 years and absorbed something of how they saw things. But the same idea. Build something that holds. He drove home in the afternoon light, Maya in the back seat with her science book open. She had moved from weather systems to something about ocean currents, a lateral expansion of the same interest in how things moved. She read quietly for most of the drive and then, somewhere on the West Side Highway with the Hudson visible to the left, she closed the book and looked out the window. Dad? she said. Yeah. I think I want to be an engineer. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out at the river, considering it the way she considered everything she was serious about. What kind? He said. She thought about it. The kind that makes sure things don't fall down. He drove. The river moved beside them. That's a good kind, he said. That evening, after Maya was in bed and the apartment had gone quiet, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the two cards, Beckett's and the infrastructure review boards, laid flat on the table in front of him. He looked at them for a while without doing anything. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. The same counter where he'd made 10,000 turkey sandwiches, where he'd helped with homework, where he'd stood on a Friday night 11 months ago and read a contract on his phone while the rice was cooking. The east window had gone dark and the city beyond it was doing its Saturday night thing, diffuse and alive and indifferent. He thought about where he had been 3 years ago. The morning shift, the A train, the invisible path between the elevator and the server room, the feeling of being a specific kind of forgettable. He didn't think about it with bitterness. He'd made the choices that needed to be made, and the choices had been right, and he wasn't interested in replaying them as tragedy. But he sat with it for a minute. The distance between that and this. A maintenance worker who noticed a number that was wrong by half a coefficient, and a bridge doesn't fail. He thought about all the places in the world where a number was wrong and nobody was there to notice. All the calculations run by committees and reviewed by qualified eyes and passed through every correct process and still wrong in the small hidden way that took years to become catastrophic. All the Ethan Coles who never happened to be in the right server room at the right time, or who were there and noticed and thought, that's not my place to say. He thought that the loneliest failure mode wasn't the catastrophic one. It was the invisible one. The error no one found because no one looked in the places where answers sometimes lived. He picked up the infrastructure review board card. He turned it over. On the back, in handwriting, someone had written a note. Crestline methodology could save lives. Please call. He set it back down. He looked at the two cards for another moment. Then he thought about Maya asleep in the next room, with her ocean currents book on the nightstand, and about Paul Okafor's son choosing a favorite crane, and about Dennis Waite updating a review protocol that would run forward through every project his team touched for the rest of his career, and about a bridge standing over the Hudson in the specific cold clarity of a late March night, the cables holding their tension, the anchor housings 4% larger than they would have been, the numbers right. There was a version of his life in which none of this happened, in which he had closed the file at 11 p.m. and gone home, and the bridge had been built with the wrong number and stood for 7 years and then shown the first crack in an anchor housing in February and been taken out of service for emergency review and been found to need significant reconstruction at enormous cost and disruption, in which the error might have been found before catastrophe or might not have. He didn't spend time in that version. It was a ghost road, and he wasn't interested in ghost roads. He was interested in what came next. He had a call to make with the Infrastructure Review Board. He had Dr. Beckett's coastal barrier assessment to review. He had a contract at Meridian that gave him his hours and his title and the direct reporting line he'd asked for, which had survived its first real test 3 months in when a project deadline had been used to pressure his schedule, and he had called Isabella directly and the schedule had been protected. He had a daughter who wanted to be the kind of engineer who made sure things didn't fall down. He had work to do. He picked up his phone and found Carmen's number and sent her a text. Bridge opened today. We walked across it. She responded in 40 seconds. How was it? He looked at the cards on the table. He looked at the east window and the city beyond it. He thought about standing at the center of the bridge with his hand on the railing and the river below and the cables above and the 43 pages of mathematics somewhere inside the concrete and steel under his feet. He typed back, "It holds." He put the phone down. He put the two cards in his wallet, in the slot where receipts usually accumulated. He got up and turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed in the ordinary dark of his ordinary apartment, and the city did what cities did through the night, and somewhere 30 miles north, the bridge held the quiet weight of nothing. No traffic yet, no load, just itself and the river and the cold air and the March stars, exactly as it had been designed to hold. That was enough. That was, in the end, all any of it had ever needed to be. The hardest thing about being unseen is not the invisibility itself. It's the slow acceptance of it, the way you begin to organize your life around being overlooked, until the overlooking feels like fact rather than failure of imagination. What this story asks is simple. Look closer. Not just at bridges. At the person pushing the maintenance cart. At the quiet one in the corner of the room. At the one who doesn't have the right lanyard, the right floor, the right title. Capability doesn't announce itself. It shows up at 11 p.m. in a server room, makes a correction, and goes home to put a child to bed. The bridges that hold are full of decisions we never see. So are the lives that do.